Hey, welcome back to the Mental Health and Christian Living podcast. I am your host, Nick Sakula, and today we're talking about the power and the reality. Really, it's almost a superpower when we dig into it deep enough of listening. It's something that we have done all of our life, yet it's something that we failed to do. I know that sounds kind of weird, but we obviously have listened and communicated all of our life. We have listen to people talk to us, get mad at us, share good things with us, whatever it is. But there is a reality to listening that sometimes we kind of pass by and maybe we need to slow down and look at. And I hope that we can explore those few things today and get you thinking about active listening and reflective listening and things that are powerful in communication that can alleviate a lot of grief and a lot of problems interpersonally. Can also lead to better, not just eliminating problems, but better communication, which I think enriches our lives. To get us started, though, since this is a Christian living kind of podcast, let's go to a passage from the Word of God. And I am going to pull this up on my screen here, and I hope that you will pull up a Bible as well. But I'm going to be pulling it from the book of John in chapter 8, and I'm reading from the New King James Version. You can read along with me, and of course you can read in your favorite version, whatever version you particularly read, and you will hear similar thought. This is in the context of Jesus and having this debate with these religious leaders in his day. They doubted his position, they doubted his authority, they doubted his being from God, and he's in a conversation about those things, and he's even talking about Abraham and their claim to be Abraham's seed, and they were claiming that through the genealogy, and Jesus is trying to get them to see that spiritually their actions, their thoughts, their deeds are not in the likeness of Abraham that they claim to be the seed of, and he's trying to teach them, but they're not listening. And there's our key. So in verse 42, this is the book of John chapter 8 verse 42, it says, Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. And then verse 43, why do you not understand my speech? And then he answers it, because you are not able to listen to my word. It brings kind of an interesting thought, and I want to keep it in the context of the scripture first so that we don't get that kind of, disjointed. Jesus was saying he's speaking, but they're not actually hearing what he is trying to communicate. In other words, they're hearing words, and they're hearing it through their lens and their perception, not seeking to understand what he is saying. And that happens a lot to us. So what does Jesus say? Why can't you accept my words or hear my words? Because you do not listen to them. So let's talk about this idea of listening. And anytime you're in a relationship, anytime a marriage, a parent and a child, a peer, a friend, a coworker, it doesn't matter. We have this idea of communicating. And we're going to come into this role with different skills. Matter of fact, it's been proven now by several studies that for most people, the most telling means for success is not IQ, your intelligence quotient, but instead what they're calling EQ, which is a quotient of our emotional intelligence, our ability to understand our own emotions and our own understanding ourselves, and to be able to understand others as they share. In other words, that communication back and forth is actually more a tell of our level of success in life than our IQ, which might throw some people off. So with that in mind, at the heart of that is the ability to listen. Now, in Jesus' example, they didn't want to hear what he had to say. They were listening for the words, but they were listening for opportunities to discredit him, to take away his authority, to take away his power, to take away from. So they weren't listening to understand, and that's the key. When we listen, what are we listening to hear? Because that matters. I'll give you a couple examples. Let's start with a marriage example. So you have a husband and a wife who are not getting along, and they've had a pattern where they have just argued and argued and argued. So they go to a marriage counselor. They go through a whole thing. It depends on the counseling. Maybe they're doing IFS. Maybe they're doing the Gottman thing. Whatever the counseling model is. So when we get down through and start talking about what the issues are, all of a sudden it becomes pretty clear that they are not listening. And it becomes clear to the counselor, the therapist, but it's not clear to them. And this is how it plays out. Okay. So a husband has his sets of understanding, his sets of expectations. The wife has her understanding and her sets of expectations, but they haven't really learned to listen or communicate those, and mostly because they don't want to hear what's being said. No, it's because they don't seek to understand the other person. They're seeking to respond. And that's a big deal. What are we listening to do, to hear, to be? Are we listening to understand? 1 Peter chapter 3, first couple of verses there, Peter challenges husbands there to, and I believe this would apply likewise to wives, but to dwell with their wives with understanding. We're seek to understand them. We're to seek to understand each other. That's the whole point. So as we're talking about listening, what are we listening for? So the husband and wife, they're going through, the therapist is trying to get them to be honest, be real with their emotions, be able to communicate those emotions, needs, wants, all those things. And it becomes apparent that they're not really listening to each other because they have this idea of who the other person is, what they already think. They've made their assumptions, they have their expectations, but they're not communicating. Now, in our made-up scenario here, we find out that the husband has been working a lot of hours. He has been working extra overtime. And the wife is not happy because he's never home. So she hasn't necessarily voiced these until she's mad, but she has been aggravated, and then she blows up, and that comes out and says, you don't care about me because you don't want to spend time with me. You only care about work and going to work and doing all this. The husband feels disrespected because in his mind, in his heart, his understanding, he's been going to work not to avoid his wife, but in this scenario, now please keep this in mind, this is a made-up scenario, but it's just to emphasize the point we're trying to make. But in his mind, he's been going to work because the best way he knows, his culture, the way he was raised, the examples that he was given, the way he communicates, love is that I'm going to provide. That is his love language, to steal from another author. But so he works hard to take care of and to provide and to even give extra, and he sees that as an act of love and service to his wife. She sees it as abandonment, he sees it as lovingness, and now they're arguing all the time because he doesn't feel respected. He's working his tail off to do something good. She doesn't see it. So he's frustrated. So when he listens, all he hears is the grief and the groans and the whatever that his wife has. The wife doesn't understand her husband either. She doesn't understand. She thinks that he's just trying to avoid. So when he speaks, all she hears is, I don't want to be, I don't want to spend time with you. Things are worth more doing this and so forth. And what you have is two people talking and no one actually listening. Because they're not listening to understand, they're listening to respond. So here's what I want to do with this, and hopefully this makes sense, and hopefully it's something that you can dive into. When we talk about listening, let's just put a few ways that we might approach it in any given scenario. We might listen for information. So you might turn on this podcast and you're listening for information, things that might help you, things that you might share. Or maybe you're even doing a sermon or a Bible class and you're like, well, I'll listen to this guy and see if he has something to say about this topic. Okay, you're listening for information. You're trying to learn something, right? You might be listening to be polite. That we've all been there, right? There's someone, maybe they annoy you, maybe they're just the yacker and you just can't process everything they have. So you just kind of smile and nod, and just kind of until you can break away. We've all been there. Okay? We're not really listening to hear, to understand. We're listening just to be polite. We might be like those who in Jesus' day were listening to Jesus to find fault. In other words, we've already decided that Jesus, or the Pharisees already decided that Jesus was not the Messiah. It didn't matter what he did or what he said, they already decided. So when they looked at him, everything they said was through that lens of it was corrupt, misleading, something like that in their hearts and in their minds, and that's what they heard. Or we listen to understand. And I hate to say this because we live with such a confirmation bias that we are just unaware of. Our brains are so efficient to try to keep and to focus on the things that are of interest to us. And there's nothing more of interest to us than what we've already decided is true. So when we're talking to people, we can naturally fall into this point of view in this repetitive nature where we're just listening to respond, or we're listening to be polite so that we can get out what we want to say. We don't listen to understand. The more we seek to listen to understand the other person, and we might call this empathy, it becomes a superpower. Now, here's some things, if this is of interest to you. One, when you're listening to someone, put aside what you want to do to respond. In other words, your natural inclination is to respond. Maybe it's to defend. Maybe it's to make sure people understand that you are of intellectual comparison to them. Maybe it is whatever, but you're looking to respond. Put it away for a moment. Especially if it's a relationship that you count dear, and say, okay, I want to listen to understand this person without judgment at all. All I want to do is know where this person is coming from and why they might be saying the things they're saying. That's empathy. I'm placing myself in their shoes. I'm not trying to prejudge. I'm not trying to make a judgment. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. All I'm doing right now is trying to listen to understand. Matter of fact, if you walk into a therapist's office, that's exactly what they're going to do with you. When you talk, they're not looking to say, ooh, that person's bad. Ooh, that person's good. Ooh, that person's right. That person's wrong. They're listening to try to understand what's happening, who it is that's talking to them, what's going on, what's their thinking like. Well, if we practice a little bit of that as individuals, we'll find out that, one, there'll be a lot less friction between us. And I'm not saying it's going to take away at all. There's always going to be disagreements, right? I mean, that's just life. But there'll be a lot less misunderstandings because I didn't just assume. I listened. And then when I respond, watch what happens. If I listened first and I truly understood what you were trying to say and where you were coming from and so forth, when I do respond, it's going to be much more in keeping with what you said to me. And that person that I listened to is going to feel and understand that idea of, hey, I was heard. Again, they may not voice it, but they're going to feel it. And we can understand what it feels like when we are speaking and someone is not really listening and how devaluing that can be. So in Jesus' day, again, that's where we started. Jesus was talking about some very, very important things, some powerful things about him, who he is, and why he was there. They had come from the Father, that these miracles and things were to display and to show who he was. That Abraham, as you go in further into the chapter, had awaited for his day and will have seen it and rejoiced in it. And they will turn around and say, you're not even 50 years old, Jesus. And you're saying you know Abraham? And that famous line, before Abraham was, I am. They pick up stones to stone him. They never heard him. They only heard what they wanted to. They only processed what they were willing to accept. And it was predetermined. Now, maybe you won't be talking to Jesus today as far as, hopefully you will be in prayer, but as far as your relationships. But might save you some anger and some frustration if you listen and then respond. But listen to understand. That's my key point. What if we practice that just a little bit more? It is really easy to fall into a rut of assumptions, to assume that you know where people are coming from, to assume that we know who people are. When we just slow down, listen, make sure we understand. So I'm going to add one more piece to this. So if we understand what I'm trying to get at as far as understanding to, or listening to understand, that empathy thing, trying to understand, not without judgment, why that person is saying what they're saying and what they're trying to communicate with those words. And we get a hold of that. We reflect it back. So we have active listening. Now we're going to have reflective listening, in which, for instance, someone says, I'm really mad, really upset about so-and-so. They went and did this, went and bought this, and they even think about telling me or asking me and so forth. Reflective is, as I listen to that, okay, so what I'm hearing is that you feel angry. And not only do you feel angry because you said that they never asked you. See, I'm reflecting back what they said. Now, I say, okay, am I getting you right? Am I understanding? Well, no, not exactly. See, now they have an opportunity to clarify, or I have an opportunity to verify. Communication in that way is not easy, but it gets down to actually resolving things. It gets down to actually being productive in our communication. But it starts with listening. It starts with listening to understand. I hope that you've gotten something from our little talk today. I hope that you would be so inclined to continue your support for this podcast. A couple ways you could do that would be really, really important and powerful for me. Would you pray for this podcast and pray for the messages that we put together, for the people that we invite in, and the content we share? I want it to be an encouragement to you, an encouragement to your Christian walk, encouragement to your emotional and mental health. But you can also do a couple physical things. One is you can like these episodes, share them on your social media, but also hit that subscribe button on YouTube. That really helps us with our exposure and getting other people to see. But really appreciate your support and look forward to talking to you next time in our next episode of mental health and Christian living. Until then, I hope that you'll give consideration to listening to understand.